The Republican presidential campaign was dominated today by financial documents released under pressure. The former frontrunner Mitt Romney put out his income tax returns hours after rival Newt Gingrich released a disputed employment contract. We begin with this report from Jeffrey Brown.
Mitt Romney wasn't talking about his taxes as he campaigned in Florida today, but at last night's debate in Tampa, he'd offered this assessment.
Will there be discussion? Sure. Will it be an article? Yeah. But is it entirely legal and fair? Absolutely. I'm proud of the fact that I pay a lot of taxes.
The filing showed the Romneys earned $21.7 million in 2010, nearly all of it investment income. They paid about $3 million in taxes for an effective tax rate of 14%, and gave about $3 million to charity, roughly half going to the Mormon Church. For 2011, Romney estimates he earned nearly $21 million and will pay about 15.4% in taxes. The candidate's father, former Michigan Governor George Romney, released 12 years of returns during his unsuccessful run for the presidency in 1967. But at last night's debate in Tampa, the son ruled out going that far.
And going out with 12 years of returns is not something I'm going to do. I'm putting out 2 years, which is more than anyone else on the stage. I think it'll satisfy the interest of the American people, see that I pay my taxes, where I give my charitable contributions to, and I think that's the right number.
Meanwhile, former House Speaker Newt Gingrich made a document dump of his own a short time before the debate. He released his 2006 contract with mortgage giant Freddie Mac to back up his assertion that he was hired to do consulting, not lobbying. During the debate, Romney said it didn't matter what Gingrich called it.
I don't think we can possibly retake the White House if the person who's leading our party is the person who was working for the chief lobbyist of Freddie Mac. Freddie Mac was paying Speaker Gingrich $1,600,000. At the same time, Freddie Mac was costing the people of Florida millions upon millions of dollars.
If you read the contract, which we've posted, and the Center for Health Transformation had to get permission to post, it has very clearly, I was supposed to do consulting work. Now, the governor did consulting work for years. I've never suggested his consulting work was lobbying. So let me start right there. There's no place in the contract that provides for lobbying. I've never done any lobbying.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you were on this stage at a prior debate. You said you were paid $300,000 by Freddie Mac as an historian. They don't pay people $25,000 a month for 6 years as historians.
Today, Gingrich said Romney's charges were ironic, given that the former Massachusetts governor was himself an investor in Freddie Mac and its sister company, Fannie Mae. For his part, former Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum charged last night that both Romney and Gingrich had abandoned conservative principles in the fights over health care and financial bailouts.
And there is no difference between President Obama and these two gentlemen, and that's why this election here in Florida is so critical, that we have someone that actually can create a contrast between the president and the conservative point of view.
Meanwhile, Texas Congressman Ron Paul said again he had no intention of launching a third-party bid, and he was asked directly about Gingrich.
Would you support a new Gingrich as nominee of the GOP?
Well, you know, he keeps hinting about attacking the Fed, and he talks about gold. Now, if I could just change him on foreign policy, we might be able to talk business.
But for now, at least, the main business of the Republican nomination fight figured to be tax returns and contracts, with the Florida vote 1 week away.
Reporters and experts spent much of this day sorting through what was and wasn't released by Mitt Romney and Newt Gingrich. And we take a closer look at what the documents tell us with a pair of reporters who've been pouring through the papers. Brody Mullins is an investigative reporter with the Wall Street Journal, and Gene Cummings is an editor at Bloomberg News. And we appreciate you both being with us. Brody Mullins, I'm going to start with you on Governor Romney. So the total income he released 2010 to 2011, $43 million almost. What was that income from?
It was mainly from investments. The tax code in the U.S. is set up in a way that when wealthy people invest in various funds and take a capital gain or dividend from that, they pay a very low tax rate, a 15% tax rate. So essentially, for not lifting a finger, for not doing any actual sweat equity, he was able to get this lower 15% tax rate, as opposed to a tax rate as high as 35%.
Roughly what kind of investments?
They were mainly through his former employer, Bain Capital, which then set up there was dozens and dozens of separate firms that Bain invested in that he was taking dividends and capital gains from.
So the tax rate around 14%,
14%.
which is pretty close to normal for this kind of income. Is that right?
Right. The normal rate would be 15%. He was at 14% or a little bit lower than that.
And how was he able to do that? I mean, remind us of the law that allows one to do
Right. When President Bush was in office, he lowered the capital gains rate to 15%. That's a lower tax rate than the normal tax rate on investment or on normal salary income. And he lowered that to 15%. And so any investment income gets taxed at that rate, and that's why he was able to.
And is there what would you say is the average or median rate that most Americans pay?
Well, most wealthy Americans pay about 30%. Newt Gingrich paid about 30%. A lot of Americans don't pay any taxes, and the average tax rate is sort of the mid-20s. So he's lower. He's half as much as most wealthy Americans.
His campaign says that he paid everything he owed, that he didn't take any aggressive steps to either avoid or defer taxes. And is that what it looks like from all these documents they released?
Well, he certainly complied with the law. He hired several smart tax attorneys to make sure that he complied with the law and got his tax rate as low as possible. I mean, he said last night, I thought it was a pretty good line when he said that he paid every dollar he owed, but not a dollar more than that. I mean, at the end of the day, he paid $3 million in taxes.
Did he have a choice in how he structured his income that affected the taxes and among other things, for example, Medicare taxes?
Right. Well, again, that's a situation that complies with the law. But when a wealthy person takes their income in the form of capital gains or dividends, they don't pay the normal Social Security tax that we all pay on our normal income. So some could say that's a tax loophole, but that's also the way the law is set up.
And so he had a choice of how to do this.
Sure. I mean, he could have. So the big debate on Capitol Hill now over carried interest and over how hedge funds and private equity funds are taxed is that they use that lower tax rate to get around taxes. They could take taxes as their regular salaries, where they'd be taxed much higher.
And just quickly, some of his investments were in overseas accounts, the Cayman Islands, some in Europe. What's the significance?
Well, it's hard to tell from the tax documents exactly what he was doing. So we can't say for sure that that he had accounts in the Cayman Islands and in Switzerland in order to avoid taxes. But by and large, most people who have accounts in those countries are there to avoid taxes.
Jean Cummings, let's talk about what we know from Newt Gingrich. He released his tax return several years' worth a couple of days ago. What did we learn broadly from that?
Well, what we learned is that Gingrich is paying roughly about where a relatively wealthy person in the country ought to be paying. He earned about $3 million, a little over that. He paid around the 30% bracket, which is pretty much the norm. However, some questions were raised about the way that he structured his income and whether he had avoided paying some of the Medicare tax because of the way he set up his corporation.
Explain how that works.
Well, he is incorporated what they call an S corporation. This is done by people who are individual businesses, private businesses, and the money that comes through, the bulk of his money was earned through his speeches, through his books, through his events. And that $3 million went through this S corporation. And according to IRS regulations, that corporation should compensate the owner of it in terms of salary at what is commensurate to the amount of work that they did to create the income. And they paid him a salary of $252,000, so much lower. Much lower,
meaning he was able to not pay or avoid paying the Medicare taxes that would have otherwise.
Yes, because he also received $2.5 million in earnings through the corporation, and that was not exposed to the Medicare tax.
Now, what about this controversial contract that he released, the contract with Freddie Mac, $1.6 million? He released for the year 2006. Mm-hmm. What did he do for Freddie Mac?
Well, according to people who work there now and people who worked there at the time that the speaker was under contract, his job there was to help develop a message that Freddie Mac could then take to Capitol Hill that would be persuasive to conservative Republicans who really wanted to crack down on Freddie Mae and Freddie Mac and impose greater impose greater regulations upon them. They also looked to him to help identify Republicans on Capitol Hill who might be open to that kind of argument.
And how is that different from being a lobbyist? Because we've heard Mitt Romney accuse Gingrich of being a lobbyist. You said whether you call yourself that or not. What's the difference?
Well, it's funny. The definition of a lobbyist is actually quite narrow. And keep in mind, it was written by members of Congress who hope someday to leave the Hill and get a great job on K Street making a lot of money. And so they wrote this definition, and it requires that a person have a paid client, make 2 contacts on Capitol Hill, and spend 20% of their time on that client in a 3-month period. You know, that's basically someone who's just going constantly as a lobbyist. And so it's a great big loophole that people can go through and not register as a lobbyist.
So how common is what Newt Gingrich did or has done among former members of Congress?
It's certainly fairly common. We have Democrats like the former Senate leader Tom Daschle, who is not registered and yet has advised healthcare companies in similar ways. Former Senate leader Trent Lott, Republican, Mississippi, similar.
And to you both, are there calls today for more information from these two, more tax returns from Mitt Romney?
So far, there haven't been a ton of calls. I would expect that there would be. And certainly, if not in the Republican primary, then once he faces off against Barack Obama, if it indeed Mitt Romney becomes a nominee, they're certainly going to ask for more tax returns.
Look, this with the speaker is not over yet. I mean, he worked for them for 5 years. He released a 1-year contract. There's a lot of material we don't know. We talked to his people today. They say they're looking for additional records, but there are many questions left unanswered.
Jean Cummings, Brody Mullins, thank you very much.
Thanks.